Well, hello and welcome. I'm Dr. David Hargroder, and you normally hear me on these Tuesday evenings with Miss Carla Hubenthal, my patient care coordinator, as we talk about various topics regarding the mini-gastric bypass. But today I wanted to do something a little bit different. Today I want to take some time to just remember the great man who was Dr. Robert Rutledge. Dr. Rutledge, the creator of the mini-gastric bypass, was truly a man that was ahead of his time. When I first met Dr. Rutledge in person, it was around 2001. But I had actually met him over the phone a year or two earlier when I had a patient of his that had developed a complication, had an ulcer, a marginal ulcer from their gastric bypass. The patient showed up in our emergency room with belly pain. She had the name of her doctor. She had the personal cell phone number of her doctor that had done her surgery, because as a kidney transplant surgeon, I wasn't aware of this relatively new procedure called the mini-gastric bypass. And so I called Dr. Rutledge on the phone. I told him I had one of his patients that he had operated on a year or so earlier in the emergency room of my hospital here in Missouri. Of course, he had operated on this patient in North Carolina. But he was very matter of fact. He said, it's probably a marginal ulcer. This is probably what you're going to find. And if you'll just put a couple of stitches in it, she should do just fine. And sure enough, that's exactly what I did. So it was that phone call and that patient that connected me to Dr. Rutledge. Hadn't given it another thought until they ended up closing down our transplant program, and I was looking for something else to do, and I thought about bariatric surgery. Weight loss surgery seemed to be the reasonable thing to do, and I actually went and took a couple of courses on the Roux-en-Y and some of these other courses that most other surgeons were doing. But then I remembered Dr. Rutledge, and I called him up and I said, I would like to learn more about your procedure, this mini-gastric bypass procedure. And keep in mind, this was back in about the year 2000 or so. This was early on during the time of the internet. We all had, our AOL accounts and email accounts, but the internet as we know it today was really non-existent. And one of the things that Dr. Rutledge was both known for and then unfairly vilified for was his use of the internet. And again, it's like I said, why I say Dr. Rutledge is a man so far ahead of his time. He started doing this mini-gastric bypass in 1997. And keep in mind also that he was already an accomplished Roux-en-Y surgeon. He was an accomplished open Roux-en-Y surgeon. He was also one of the first surgeons in the state of North Carolina to perform the laparoscopic Roux-en-Y. And if you hear Dr. Rutledge tell the story about how he became a bariatric surgeon, it was kind of an amusing story, because he was at this particular hospital. I can't remember if it was at Duke or if it was at University of North Carolina, but at one of those hospitals where he was their trauma surgeon and general surgeon, and the chairman of the department had called him in one day and told him that he needed him to start doing bariatric surgery, and that's how he became a bariatric surgeon. But he did so much in the way of innovation. You know, even today in the state of Missouri, the trauma registry, the computer program we use to keep track of all of our trauma data, was actually a program written by Dr. Rutledge. So Dr. Rutledge's computer savviness was well known even outside of the specialty of general surgery. But he was a general surgeon. He had started doing this bariatric surgery, and then he developed this idea of, hey, I've been doing this Roux-en-Y surgery, which is kind of a complicated configuration of how we have to do that, how we have to put the bowel back together and everything. And so he came up with a new technique, and it was really inspired by a night of trauma call where he had a gunshot wound to the abdomen come in from a gunshot, from a drug deal that had gone bad. 357 Magnum, right to the gut. And as a trauma surgeon, he rushed the patient to the operating room, stopped whatever bleeding there was, and assessed the damage and determined that there was an injury to the pancreas and to the duodenum. And in order to remedy that problem, he had to bypass those injured areas, and he did so by simply bringing a loop of jejunum, a loop of small bowel, up to the stomach. And the following morning, he actually had a procedure scheduled for a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, but it happened to be on a friend of his, somebody that he knew, someone that he worked with in the operating room. And so he approached this patient and said, hey, I've got this crazy idea. Instead of doing a classic Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, how about I simply bring up a loop of bowel like I did on this trauma patient last night? I think it'll be a lot faster, quicker, easier. The patient was agreeable, and the first mini-gastric bypass was born, and that was in 1997. And then it was in the year 2000 that Dr. Rutledge presented the results of his first 1,200 cases that he had done. And he did so at a meeting in Las Vegas of the American Society of Bariatric Surgeons. And it was at that meeting that the surgeons that heard his presentation lined up, literally lined up at the microphone to argue and debate his results, because nobody believed that his results could possibly be as good as he was stating that they were. Nobody came out and called him a liar, but that's certainly what they were alluding to. And most of the sentiment and most of the attitude was, this is impossible. You can't have this good of results with this operation, because this operation has been tried before. And of course, what they were referring to was the old Mason procedure, a procedure developed by Dr. Ed Mason back in the early 50s, which was a loop bypass with one important difference, and that was the way Dr. Mason created his stomach pouch was different than the way Dr. Rutledge created his stomach pouch. Dr. Mason created his stomach pouch as a little walnut-sized stomach high up by the esophagus, much like the Roux-en-Y is today. And Dr. Rutledge realized that that was a mistake. It needed to be a long, skinny stomach along the lesser curve, and that's what he created. And in so doing, basically eliminated the problems that Dr. Mason had faced with his earlier operation that ultimately led to Dr. Mason abandoning his operation in the 50s. So surgeons of the early 2000s could not get over this, couldn't how do I put it? You know, they couldn't get past the changes. They couldn't acknowledge the changes or recognize that the changes that Dr. Rutledge had created were small but powerful changes. Little tweaks is all it was. He, instead of having the stomach high up by the esophagus, he made it long and skinny. That took care of the reflux issues that patients complained about. In addition, instead of that loop being way up, drug way up to the near the esophagus, which created a lot of tension, making for a tenuous anastomosis, now with this long, skinny stomach, you could connect that loop way down low under no tension at all. And so these two simple tweaks to an old 40-year-old operation changed the game and made this a spectacularly successful and safe and effective operation for weight loss. Now, I, having stopped doing transplants, decided I wanted to learn weight loss surgery, and so I reached out to Dr. Rutledge in around 2000, 2001, and I missed that meeting in 2000. I wish I could have been there to hear the response from all the surgeons who were arguing with him. That meeting actually, I think, was in Washington, D.C. The following year, the meeting was in Las Vegas, and I was able to go to that meeting. And again, I watched Dr. Rutledge give a presentation, and I watched him invite other surgeons. Hey, look, if you don't like my data, if you don't think my data is accurate, I've got a great idea. We're all scientists here. Why don't I take 100 of my patients, and let's take 100 of your patients, and let's write a paper together. Like, let's write a paper over 100 Roux-en-Y's versus 100 MGBs. Never got any takers. Never got any takers. But even back then, back in the early 2000s, Dr. Rutledge was communicating with all of his patients through email. He was sending them home with a little thumb drive that had their operative note on it, along with the patient manual and some other things. He had patients coming from all across the country because he did a lot of his work internet-based. He was actually condemned, if you will, for his internet use, as though it were a bad thing, as though he were some sort of traveling surgeon, you know, not close to home taking care of his patients. And he actually did get some complaints filed against him in the professional organizations because of his use of the internet and email, which, again, when we look today at where we are and we see that, you know, every doctor in every modern practice today, and especially post-COVID, is using the internet either to keep track of their patients through their medical records communication or email or what have you. So again, Dr. Rutledge, way ahead of his time. When I expressed an interest in learning this mini-gastric bypass, Dr. Rutledge couldn't have been more gracious. He invited me up to North Carolina to watch him perform his operation. And of course, I took him up on that offer without any hesitation. And it was interesting because I had just finished a course on the Roux-en-Y that I had done in Dallas. And I mean, they made a big production out of it. I got to watch a surgery, and there were like 2 or 3 surgeons in the operating room, plus the anesthesiologist and 2 or 3 assistants, and took 2.5 hours to finish the whole operation, you know. So I go up to North Carolina to this little community hospital where Dr. Rutledge, with one assistant and one nurse anesthetist, completed 5 mini-gastric bypass before noon. And it was just truly amazing to watch. His skill, how smooth everything went. And then I stayed overnight, and the next day went and rounded with him on everybody. And all these patients were walking the halls and ready to go home, when most patients having weight loss surgery at the time were having open procedures, and even those that were having laparoscopic procedures, they were 2, 3, 4 hour long operations with a week-long stay in the hospital and 3 or 4 days in the ICU. And here Dr. Rutledge was doing this 30-40 minute operation, sending patients home the next day, and they were doing great. And yet the medical community was all critical of him because they just thought he was doing a terrible operation and a terrible disservice to all of his patients. And despite Dr. Rutledge's efforts to try and teach this wonderful operations to surgeons around the country, other than myself and 3 or 4 other open-minded, interested individuals who took the time to look at the data and to learn the operation, other than myself, Dr. Caesar Pragley down in Orlando area, another couple of surgeons in the High Point, North Carolina area, now there's Dr. Billy in Encino, California, but even he came about not all that long ago. So for almost 20 years, it was me and 1 or 2 other surgeons doing this operation around the country. And the way Dr. Rutledge did it was also brilliant. I called him up and said I was interested in learning his operation. Now, for most surgeons, the way you would learn a new operation is you'd either have to spend a whole lot of money and go and take a course and learn it, or go do a residency or a fellowship program. But what Dr. Rutledge did was he kind of took me under his wing, and he actually got his Missouri medical license, and he got his credentials at the hospital that I was at, so I didn't have to travel to him, he traveled to me. And since he had patients that came from all over the country, he just redirected his patients from his hospital in North Carolina to our hospital in Joplin. And for about 6 months, he and I operated together side by side until we finally got to a place where I would call him if I needed him, but otherwise he was sitting in the doctor's lounge, just kind of waiting on my phone call. And eventually, after about 6 months, when he decided that it was time to pass the hat, so to speak, I'll never forget, he went out and bought a couple of these white felt Stetson hats, and he made a big production around the hospital saying there was a new sheriff in town, that he wasn't going to be coming around anymore, that I was going to be doing these MGBs on my own. And that was a proud moment and a lot of fun, a little bit of silliness, but we had a lot of fun that day. Dr. Rutledge, tried to spread the word of the MGB around the United States, and the U.S. just wouldn't have any part of it. And so surgeons from around the world started taking an interest. Dr. Kular in India, in particular, was one of the surgeons that took a particular interest, and that's where Dr. Rutledge has now spent most of his last days, was in India, with who became his very dear friend and colleague, Dr. Kular, who's also now a very dear friend of mine. And I appreciate all that he's done to promote and advance the field of bariatrics through the mini-gastric bypass. A number of other surgeons from around the world also embraced Dr. Rutledge's procedure. Surgeons in Germany, in Italy, in Greece, in Australia, in Mexico, South America. Dr. Rutledge traveled the world because he couldn't travel the United States. There were no surgeons in the U.S. that were interested in learning. Matter of fact, he sent me to teach a few surgeons that had expressed an interest, but none of those surgeons really ever took off. And so the program was always been limited to just the few programs that we've had here in the U.S. between myself, Dr. Pragley, and Dr. Rutledge. But for the last 10 or 15 years, Rutledge has sort of been back and forth between the United States and India, which has really become his second home, and where his funeral services and burial will be. I think the world has lost a really great man, a great surgeon, an innovator who was really ahead of his time. He's going to be greatly missed by me. I know he certainly did change my life for the better in learning this operation. It's been so much of a fulfilling practice that I've had when you compare it to just the run-of-the-mill gallbladders and hernias, etc. Even the kidney transplants that I've did back in the day, you have grateful patients and you keep track of them, but you know, they're still a little sick. They're always worried about rejection, etc. Whereas the MGB patients, their lives are just changed so profoundly that it really is an honor and a privilege to have been a student of Dr. Rutledge, who I believe is going to go down in the history of weight loss surgery, bariatric. When the bariatric history books are written, I think Dr. Rutledge is going to be one of the greats, and I'm just happy to be one of the coattail hangers, riding along for the satisfaction and enjoyment of it. I hope you all appreciate the little bit of background information I've given on Dr. Rutledge, and feel free to pass this along to any of his patients that might enjoy hearing it. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back again with Carla next Tuesday, and I'm sure she'll have an interesting topic for us. Thank you. Good night.